Picture this, it's 1498. A small fleet of battered wooden ships appears on the horizon of Calicut, India. The local merchants laugh at these strange Europeans. Their ships are tiny compared to the massive Chinese junks and Arab dhows that dominate these waters. But within just 20 years, these laughable Portuguese vessels will shatter a trading empire that stood for over 1,000 years, turning the Indian Ocean blood red and rewriting the rules of global power forever. Today, I'm revealing the brutal engineering genius and ruthless tactics that allowed a tiny European nation to conquer the world's richest ocean. But before we dive into this incredible story of maritime domination, do me a huge favor. Smash that subscribe button and hit the like icon. Trust me, what you're about to discover will change how you see naval history forever. Let me take you back to 15th century Portugal. I'm standing on the docks of Lisbon, and I can tell you right now, what I'm looking at doesn't seem revolutionary at first glance. But these ships, these beautiful wooden vessels bobbing in the harbor, are about to change world history in ways nobody could imagine. The Portuguese didn't just build ships, they engineered weapons of economic warfare. And it all started with two revolutionary designs, the caravel and the carrack. The caravel was Portugal's secret weapon for exploration. I want you to understand something crucial here. Before the caravel, European ships were designed for the Mediterranean or coastal waters. They were either too heavy to sail against the wind or too fragile for open ocean voyages. The caravel changed everything. This ship was typically between 50 to 70 feet long, which sounds small, but here's the genius. It used lateen sails, those triangular sails you see in Arabic ships, combined with square sails from European tradition. This hybrid design meant the caravel could sail closer to the wind than anything else on the water. It could tack, it could maneuver, and most importantly, it could explore coastlines and return home against prevailing winds. When I look at the design specifications, I'm amazed by the innovation. The caravel had a shallow draft, meaning it could navigate close to shores, explore rivers, and escape into shallow waters where larger ships couldn't follow. It was fast, averaging about 8 knots under good conditions, and it was nimble, responding to the helm like a sports car compared to the cargo trucks that dominated medieval shipping. But the caravel had limitations. It was perfect for exploration. But when Portugal needed to dominate the Indian Ocean trade, they needed something bigger, something more intimidating, something that could carry both cargo and firepower. That's where the carrack enters our story. The carrack was the evolution, the big brother, the warship that would actually conquer the Indian Ocean. These ships were massive by the standards of the time, often exceeding 100 feet in length and displacing 500 to 1,000 tons. Some of the largest carracks displaced over 2,000 tons, making them floating fortresses. What made the carrack special wasn't just its size, it was the design philosophy. The Portuguese built these ships with high forecastles and stern castles, creating elevated fighting platforms. Imagine trying to board a ship when the defenders are standing 20 feet above you, raining down arrows, stones, and boiling oil. It was nearly impossible. The hull design was revolutionary too. The carrack used a combination of carvel planking, where planks are laid edge to edge rather than overlapping, creating a smooth hull that reduced drag and increased speed. The reinforced hull could withstand the pounding of ocean waves for months at a time. And more importantly, it could absorb cannon fire better than anything else on the water. But here's what really mattered. These ships were built as weapons platforms. Every design decision, from the width of the beam to the height of the decks, was made with one question in mind. How do we mount more cannons and make them more effective? I'm looking at historical records, and the numbers are staggering. A typical Portuguese carrack sailing to India in the early 1500s would carry between 30 to 50 cannons. The largest ones could mount over 100 guns. Compare that to the Arab dhows and Indian trading vessels, which might carry a handful of small cannon at best, and you start to understand the asymmetry of power. The Portuguese also innovated in sail design for the carrack. They used a combination of square sails on the foremast and mainmast for speed in following winds, and lateen sails on the mizzenmast for maneuverability. This combination meant a carrack could outsail almost anything when running before the wind, and still maneuver effectively in combat. The construction itself was an art form. Portuguese shipwrights used oak for the frames and planking, pine for masts, and rope made from hemp. They sealed the hulls with pitch and tar. Every ship was essentially handcrafted, with master builders passing down techniques through generations. What really strikes me about these ships is the human element. A carrack bound for India would carry between 200 to 400 men, sailors, soldiers, gunners, officers and passengers. Living conditions were brutal. Men slept on the decks or in cramped quarters below. Disease was rampant. The voyage from Lisbon to India could take 6 to 8 months, and mortality rates often exceeded 30%. But these ships kept coming, year after year, fleet after fleet, because the rewards were worth the risks. A single successful voyage to India could make investors rich beyond their wildest dreams. The profit margins on spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves were often 400 to 500%. The Portuguese perfected something else too, the annual Carreira da India, the India Run. This was a scheduled fleet system where multiple carracks would sail together for protection. They'd leave Lisbon in March or April, sail around the Cape of Good Hope, and arrive in India by September. They'd trade, load cargo, and return, arriving back in Lisbon the following year. This systematic approach, this logistical thinking was revolutionary. The Portuguese weren't just sending out random expeditions. They were creating a maritime highway, a predictable system of trade and power projection that would last for decades. Now let me tell you about the real game changer, the innovation that made Portuguese domination inevitable: naval artillery. I want you to understand something fundamental. Before the Portuguese arrived in the Indian Ocean, naval warfare in that region was largely about boarding actions. Ships would maneuver close to each other, soldiers would jump across, and combat was hand-to-hand. It was brutal, bloody, and personal. The ship with more soldiers usually won. The Portuguese looked at this system and said, "Why fight fair when we can fight smart?" They brought cannons, lots of cannons, and they didn't just mount them on deck as an afterthought. They integrated artillery into the very design of their ships, creating the world's first true naval gun platforms. Let me break down the revolution. The Portuguese used several types of cannons, each with specific purposes. The heaviest were the bombarders and canhões, massive guns that fired stone or iron balls weighing 30 to 60 pounds. These were ship killers, designed to punch holes through hulls and masts from distances of 300 yards or more. Then they had the smaller but equally important pedreiros and berchos, swivel guns mounted on the rails that could fire loads of small shot into enemy crews. These were anti-personnel weapons, devastating against soldiers massed on decks preparing to board. The innovation wasn't just in having these weapons. It was in how they used them. Portuguese naval tactics revolutionized warfare. Instead of closing for boarding, Portuguese ships would stand off at distance and pummel their enemies with cannon fire. They'd maneuver to control the weather gauge, using wind advantage to dictate the range and terms of engagement. I'm reading accounts of battles, and the pattern is always the same. Local ships would try to close for boarding. Portuguese ships would keep their distance, using their superior sailing qualities and gunnery to destroy the enemy at range. It was like bringing a rifle to a knife fight. The Battle of Cochin in 1504 perfectly illustrates this. A fleet of around 80 Arab and Indian ships attacked a Portuguese force of just 11 vessels. The local commanders were confident. They had overwhelming numbers, But the Portuguese used their artillery to devastating effect, sinking or disabling dozens of enemy ships without ever letting them close enough to board. The local fleet was annihilated. The Portuguese also innovated in gunnery technique. They trained specialized crews, men who did nothing but serve the cannons. They developed tactics for coordinated broadsides, where multiple guns would fire simultaneously to maximize shock and damage. They experimented with different types of shot: round balls for penetration, chain shot to destroy rigging, and grape shot to sweep enemy decks. The psychological impact was enormous. Imagine you're a sailor on an Arab dhow. You've fought sea battles before, you're brave, you're skilled with a sword. Then suddenly, from hundreds of yards away, your ship is being torn apart by explosions. Your mast crashes down. Your companions are being ripped apart by flying splinters. You can't even see the enemy clearly, let alone fight back. It's not warfare, it's slaughter. The Portuguese understood this psychological dimension. They weren't just trying to sink enemy ships, they were trying to break the will to resist. And it worked. Within a generation, the reputation of Portuguese firepower was so fearsome that many local rulers simply surrendered rather than fight. The logistics of this artillery revolution was staggering. Every cannonball had to be shipped from Europe or manufactured locally. Gunpowder had to be kept dry through months at sea in humid tropical conditions. Cannons themselves were incredibly heavy, affecting ship stability and speed. The Portuguese solved these problems through careful planning, stockpiling ammunition at their fortresses, and designing ships specifically to handle the weight of artillery. I'm fascinated by the economic dimension too. Cannons were expensive. A single large cannon could cost as much as a year's wages for a skilled craftsman. Outfitting a carrack with 40 cannons represented an enormous capital investment. But the Portuguese crown and private investors understood that this firepower was what made domination possible. They paid the price because the returns were worth it. The artillery revolution also changed fortress design in the Indian Ocean. Traditional coastal defenses in Asia were built to resist land armies or boarding attacks from the sea. They weren't designed to withstand sustained cannon bombardment. Portuguese ships could anchor offshore and literally knock down city walls. This capability gave them leverage in negotiations and made coastal cities vulnerable in ways they'd never been before. Now I need to tell you about the man who started this whole imperial project, Vasco da Gama. And I'm going to be honest with you. This isn't a story about a hero. This is a story about ambition, brutality, and the birth of European colonialism. It's 1497, and I'm watching 4 ships leave Lisbon harbor. The flagship is the São Gabriel, commanded by Vasco da Gama himself. He's been chosen by King Manuel I for the most important mission in Portuguese history: find the sea route to India. Da Gama wasn't the first to try. Bartolomeu Dias had rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, proving it was possible. But da Gama's mission was different. He wasn't just exploring. He was ordered to reach India, establish trade relations, and assess the possibility of Portuguese dominance in Asian waters. The voyage down the African coast was grueling. I'm reading da Gama's logs, and the suffering is palpable. Scurvy broke out. That terrible disease caused by vitamin C deficiency that makes your gums rot, your teeth fall out, and old wounds reopen. Men died screaming. At one point, so many sailors were sick that da Gama barely had enough healthy men to work the ships. But in November 1497, they rounded the Cape of Good Hope. Then they sailed up the East African coast, stopping at Mozambique, Mombasa, and finally Malindi. At each stop, da Gama used a combination of diplomacy and violence to get what he needed. In Mozambique, the local sultan was friendly at first, but when he realized the Portuguese were Christians, not Muslims as he'd assumed, tensions rose. Da Gama's response? He bombarded the town and sailed away. This pattern would repeat itself throughout the voyage. At Malindi, da Gama got lucky. He hired a pilot, probably Ahmad ibn Majid, one of the greatest navigators of the Indian Ocean. This pilot knew the monsoon winds, the currents, the safe harbors. With his guidance, da Gama's fleet sailed directly across the Arabian Sea to Calicut, on the western coast of India. They arrived in May 1498, and I can only imagine the shock on both sides. The Portuguese had done it. They'd found the sea route to India, but now came the hard part, convincing the locals to trade. The Zamorin of Calicut, the local ruler, received da Gama politely, but he was unimpressed by the Portuguese gifts. Some cloth, hats, wash basins, and honey. These were the kinds of trinkets you might give to African coastal chiefs. The Zamorin was the ruler of one of the richest trading ports in the world. He dealt in gold, silk, precious stones, and spices. Portuguese cheap goods were almost insulting. Making matters worse, the Arab merchants in Calicut saw the Portuguese as a threat to their monopoly. They controlled the spice trade, buying from Indian producers and selling to Egyptian and Venetian traders. The arrival of European ships that could buy directly threatened to destroy their entire business model. Da Gama managed to trade for some spices, but he made more enemies than friends. When he left India in August 1498, he took several hostages with him, a move that infuriated the Zamorin. The voyage home was even more brutal than the journey out. More men died of scurvy. The ships were barely seaworthy, but da Gama was driven. He'd achieved what everyone said was impossible. He'd reached India by sea. He arrived back in Lisbon in September 1499, nearly 2 years after he'd left. Of the approximately 170 men who'd started the voyage, only about 54 returned. The human cost was staggering, but da Gama was a hero. He'd opened the route to Asian wealth, and Portugal would never be the same. King Manuel I immediately started planning a follow-up expedition, but they didn't send da Gama. Instead, they sent a much larger fleet under Pedro Alvarez Cabral, with 13 ships and 1,500 men. This wasn't an exploration mission. This was an armed trading fleet, designed to establish Portuguese dominance by force if necessary. Da Gama wouldn't return to India until 1502, and this second voyage revealed his true character. He commanded a fleet of 20 ships with explicit orders to terrorize the Arab trading network into submission. And terrorize he did. One incident stands out in horrifying detail. Da Gama captured an Arab ship, the Mary, returning from Mecca with hundreds of pilgrims. Despite pleas for mercy, despite offers of ransom, da Gama ordered the ship set on fire. Men, women, and children burned alive or drowned trying to escape. It was a calculated act of terror, designed to send a message. The Portuguese would show no mercy to those who opposed them. Da Gama bombarded Calicut, destroying much of the port. He killed prisoners in sight of the shore. He cut off the noses, ears, and hands of captives and sent them back to the Zamorin as a message. His tactics were so brutal that even his own men were shocked. But from a strategic perspective, it worked. The Portuguese established themselves as the dominant military power in the Indian Ocean. Local rulers learned that resistance was costly. Within a few years, Portugal had built a network of fortresses and trading posts from East Africa to Indonesia. Da Gama would return to India one more time in 1524, this time as viceroy, but he died just 3 months after arriving, likely from malaria. He was buried in Cochin, though his remains were later moved back to Portugal. I think about da Gama's legacy, and it's complicated. He was undoubtedly a skilled navigator and a driven leader, but he was also ruthlessly violent, willing to commit atrocities to achieve his goals. He opened up global trade routes that would transform the world economy, but at a terrible human cost. Now let me explain how Portugal actually controlled the Indian Ocean. Because here's the thing, they were always outnumbered. They were thousands of miles from home. Local powers had vastly larger populations and resources. So how did a tiny European nation dominate one of the world's most important trading zones for over a century? The answer is a carefully calibrated strategy of terror, choke point control, and economic leverage. First, let me talk about the Cartaz system. This was Portugal's protection racket, and it was brilliantly effective. The Portuguese declared that any ship sailing in the Indian Ocean needed a cartaz, a trading license issued by Portuguese authorities. No cartaz, your ship would be seized or sunk. To enforce this, the Portuguese used their naval superiority. They stationed squadrons at key locations, and their ships would stop and inspect any vessel they encountered. If you had a cartaz and were carrying approved cargo, you could proceed. If not, your cargo was confiscated and your ship might be burned. The genius of this system was that it turned the Portuguese from just another trading power into the gatekeepers of all trade. They didn't need to carry all the cargo themselves. They just needed to tax everyone else who did. It was like controlling a toll road instead of being one truck among many. The economic impact was enormous. Portuguese revenues from cartaz fees alone were substantial, but the real power was in the control itself. The Portuguese could favor allies, punish enemies, and manipulate prices by controlling who could trade where. Let me talk about the choke points. The Portuguese identified the critical strategic locations in the Indian Ocean and built fortresses there. The three most important were Hormuz, controlling access to the Persian Gulf; Malacca, controlling the strait between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea; and Goa, which became the capital of Portuguese India. Hormuz was captured in 1515, and its control gave Portugal leverage over Persian and Arab trade. Any goods moving between the Persian Gulf and India had to pass Portuguese inspection. The customs revenue alone from Hormuz was enormous. Malacca fell in 1511, and this was even more strategically important. The Strait of Malacca was, and still is, one of the most important shipping lanes in the world. Controlling Malacca meant controlling trade between India and China, between the Spice Islands and everywhere else. It was checkmate on the chessboard of Asian trade. Goa was different. Captured in 1510, it wasn't as strategically located as Hormuz or Malacca, but it had an excellent harbour. It was on the western coast of India, close to the spice-producing regions, and it had enough local agricultural production to support a Portuguese population. Goa became the capital, the administrative centre from which the entire Portuguese Empire in Asia was governed. The Portuguese also built or captured dozens of smaller fortresses along the East African coast, in Sri Lanka, along the Indian coast, and in Indonesia. Each fortress served multiple purposes: military base, trading post, customs office, and symbol of Portuguese power. Now let me talk about the terror tactics, because this is where things get dark. The Portuguese understood that they couldn't fight everyone simultaneously, so they made examples of those who resisted. Examples so brutal that others would think twice before challenging Portuguese authority. When ports refused to trade on Portuguese terms, the response was often bombardment and massacre. When Arab traders tried to bypass the cartaz system, Portuguese ships would hunt them down and make public displays of the consequences. Crews would be hanged from the yardarms. Ships would be burned in sight of shore. Captives would be mutilated and sent back as warnings. I'm not justifying these tactics, I'm explaining them. The Portuguese were using terror as a tool of policy, demonstrating that the cost of resistance was higher than the cost of cooperation. But here's what's interesting. The Portuguese also used diplomacy and trade incentives. They would offer protection to rulers who cooperated, genuine protection against pirates and rival powers. They would offer favorable trade terms. They would provide military assistance, sometimes sending Portuguese soldiers and artillery to help allied rulers in local conflicts. This carrot-and-stick approach was sophisticated. The Portuguese weren't just mindless conquerors. They were building a system of control that mixed violence, economics, diplomacy, and strategic positioning. They also understood the importance of intelligence. Portuguese officials cultivated networks of informants in every major port. They gathered information about shipping schedules, cargo values, political developments, and potential threats. This intelligence network gave them the ability to anticipate and counter challenges before they became serious. The religious dimension was important too. The Portuguese saw themselves as crusaders, bringing Christianity to Asia and fighting against Islam. This religious motivation justified their violence in their own minds and gave them a sense of mission that sustained them through incredible hardships. But over time, the system started to break down. Local powers learned to work around Portuguese control. Alternative trade routes developed. Other European powers, especially the Dutch and English, arrived with their own armed fleets. The Portuguese monopoly began to crack. Let me tell you about one of the most important naval battles you've probably never heard of, the Battle of Diu. This wasn't just another fight. This was the moment when Portugal's fate in the Indian Ocean was decided. It's 1509. And I'm watching events unfold that will change history. The Portuguese have been in the Indian Ocean for just over a decade, but they've already made powerful enemies. Chief among them is the Sultan of Gujarat, allied with the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt and the Zamorin of Calicut. These powers represent the old order, the established trading networks that the Portuguese are threatening to destroy. The combined fleet that assembles at Diu is massive. Historical accounts vary, but most sources agree there were around 100 to 200 ships, including large warships and smaller support vessels. The fleet was commanded by Malik Ayaz, the governor of Diu, and included Egyptian Mamluk ships with artillery and experienced crews. The Portuguese force. Just 18 ships under the command of Francisco de Almeida, the viceroy of Portuguese India. The disparity in numbers was overwhelming, but Almeida had confidence in his ships, his guns, and his tactics. The battle began in early February 1509. The Allied fleet expected a traditional engagement, maneuvering, boarding, hand-to-hand combat, but Almeida had no intention of fighting that kind of battle. The Portuguese ships sailed in a line, presenting their broadsides to the enemy. As the Allied fleet tried to close, Portuguese cannons opened fire. The effect was devastating. I'm reading accounts that describe the chaos, ships splintering under cannon fire, masts crashing down, men screaming as round shot tore through packed decks. The Allied fleet couldn't effectively respond. Their ships weren't designed as gun platforms. Many of their cannons were mounted on the upper decks, which made them unstable firing platforms. The Portuguese, with guns mounted low in the hull, could deliver more stable and accurate fire. The battle lasted several hours, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Portuguese gunnery and ship handling were simply superior. By the end of the day, dozens of Allied ships had been sunk or captured. The rest fled. Portuguese casualties were minimal. The strategic consequences of Diu were enormous. The combined Muslim fleet had represented the best chance to expel the Portuguese from the Indian Ocean. Its destruction meant that no local power had the naval capability to challenge Portuguese dominance. The old trading networks would have to accommodate the new reality of Portuguese control. The Sultan of Gujarat sued for peace. The Mamluks abandoned their efforts in the Indian Ocean. The Zamorin of Calicut, who had been counting on this alliance to drive out the Portuguese, realized he was on his own. For Portugal, Diu confirmed what they already believed, that their naval technology and tactics gave them an insurmountable advantage. This confidence led to even more aggressive policies in the following years, but I think there's a deeper lesson in Diu. This battle represented a turning point in global history. It wasn't just about Portugal versus local powers. It was about the arrival of European-style naval warfare in Asian waters. The age when local maritime powers could operate independently was ending. The age of European dominance was beginning. Now I want to explain how Portugal maintained control for so long. The fortress system. Because ships alone weren't enough. The Portuguese needed permanent bases, places to repair ships, store goods, station troops, and project power. Between 1500 and 1520, Portugal built or captured over 50 fortresses across the Indian Ocean world. These weren't just military installations. They were the nodes of a global network, each one serving multiple functions in Portugal's imperial system. Let me walk you through what a typical Portuguese fortress looked like. The design followed a pattern developed in Europe, but adapted for Asian conditions. Thick stone walls, usually 15 to 20 feet high and 6 to 10 feet thick. Corner bastions mounting heavy artillery that could cover all approaches. A central keep, or citadel, where defenders could make a last stand. Wells for water and magazines for gunpowder and food, allowing the fortress to withstand sieges. Inside, there would be barracks for soldiers, warehouses for trade goods, workshops for ship repair, a church, living quarters for the captain and officers, and often a prison. Each fortress was a self-contained Portuguese town, maintaining European culture and military discipline thousands of miles from home. The fortress at Goa was the most impressive. By the mid-1500s, it had evolved into a European-style city with cathedrals, palaces, hospitals, and a population of several thousand Portuguese, plus many more local residents. Goa became known as Golden Goa, the jewel of Portuguese Asia. Malacca's fortress controlled the strategic strait. Its walls were built from the stones of demolished mosques, a deliberate statement of Portuguese power and Christian triumph. The fortress mounted dozens of cannons covering the harbour and approaches, making it nearly impregnable to Asian forces. Hormuz, at the entrance to the Persian Gulf, was built on an island of salt and rock. Conditions were brutal, the heat unbearable, fresh water scarce. But its strategic value made all hardship worthwhile. Hormuz generated enormous customs revenue and gave Portugal leverage over Persian and Arab trade. The fortress system worked because it created a network of mutual support. Ships could sail from fortress to fortress, never being more than a few days from a friendly port. If one fortress was threatened, nearby bases could send reinforcements. Trade goods could be stored safely and shipped when market conditions were favorable. But maintaining this system was incredibly expensive. Each fortress needed a garrison, usually 100 to 500 soldiers. They needed artillery, ammunition, and supplies. Ships needed to be stationed at each location for patrol and defense. The logistical challenge of keeping this empire supplied and manned from Portugal was enormous. The annual India fleet would carry not just trade goods, but soldiers, munitions, food, tools, and replacement personnel. The return voyage would bring spices, but also reports, requests for reinforcements, and men whose terms of service had ended. Mortality was horrific. Disease, combat, accidents, and simple exhaustion killed Portuguese soldiers and sailors in appalling numbers. Some estimates suggest that only 1 in 3 men who sailed to Asia ever returned to Portugal. The empire consumed Portuguese manpower like a furnace, yet the fortresses endured. Some, like Goa, would remain in Portuguese hands for over 450 years. Others would fall to local powers or European rivals, but the system as a whole proved remarkably resilient. Now I need to tell you how it all fell apart. Because Portugal's dominance in the Indian Ocean wasn't eternal. In fact, by the early 1600s, the empire was already in crisis. Several factors contributed to the decline. First, the Portuguese never had enough manpower. The population of Portugal in 1500 was only about 1 million people, Maintaining an empire stretching from Brazil to Japan with such a small population base was nearly impossible. The constant need for soldiers, sailors, and administrators drained Portugal's limited human resources. Second, other European powers arrived. The Dutch and English weren't impressed by Portuguese claims to monopoly. Starting in the 1590s, Dutch and English ships began appearing in Asian waters. And these weren't exploratory vessels. These were armed trading fleets backed by powerful chartered companies, the Dutch East India Company, VOC, and the English East India Company. These companies had something Portugal never developed: efficient corporate organization. They had massive capital, diversified investments, and professional management. They could absorb losses that would bankrupt Portuguese traders. And they had military power to back their commercial ambitions. The Dutch were particularly aggressive. Between 1600 and 1650, they systematically attacked Portuguese positions throughout Asia. Malacca fell in 1641. The Spice Islands were captured, Ceylon was taken, the Portuguese were pushed out of most of Indonesia. By mid-century, Portuguese power in Asia was reduced to a few strongholds: Goa, Macau, and Timor. The English were more focused on India itself, but their presence further eroded Portuguese trade monopolies. Local rulers learned they could play European powers against each other, negotiating better terms by threatening to trade with the English or Dutch instead of the Portuguese. Internal problems plagued Portugal too. The union of the Portuguese and Spanish crowns from 1580 to 1640 was a disaster for the Portuguese Empire. Spain's enemies became Portugal's enemies. The Dutch, fighting for independence from Spain, attacked Portuguese possessions as extensions of Spanish power. Portugal's focus and resources were diverted to Spanish priorities. Corruption was endemic. Officials in Asia were supposed to serve the Portuguese crown, but many were more interested in personal enrichment. They traded illegally, took bribes, and embezzled funds. The system rotted from within. The Cartaz system broke down. Pirates and smugglers learned to avoid Portuguese patrols. Local traders developed alternative routes. The Portuguese simply didn't have enough ships to enforce their regulations across such a vast area. By 1700, Portuguese power in Asia was a shadow of what it had been. Goa remained the capital of Portuguese India, but it controlled only a small territory. Portuguese traders were just one group among many, no longer dominant, yet Portugal held on to some possessions with remarkable tenacity. Goa wouldn't be annexed by India until 1961. Macau remained Portuguese until 1999. East Timor stayed Portuguese until 1975. These remnants of empire outlasted most European colonial holdings, though they were more symbolic than substantive by then. So there you have it, the incredible story of how Portuguese ships conquered the Indian Ocean. From the revolutionary ship designs to the brutal tactics, from Vasco da Gama's first voyage to the slow decline of empire, we've covered one of the most important chapters in global history. The Portuguese achievement was remarkable. A nation of just 1 million people dominated the richest trading zone in the world for over a century. They revolutionized naval warfare, created the first global maritime empire, and opened up trade routes that would shape the modern world. But it was also a story of brutality, exploitation, and cultural destruction. The Portuguese didn't come as guests or equals. They came as conquerors, and they used violence without hesitation to achieve their goals. Understanding this history helps us understand our present world. The patterns of global trade, the roots of colonialism, the origins of European global dominance. All of this has its foundations in what the Portuguese did in the Indian Ocean 500 years ago. Now here's what I need from you. If you found this video valuable, if you learned something new, hit that subscribe button right now. I create detailed historical content like this regularly, and subscribing ensures you won't miss future episodes. And here's the really important part. Leave a comment below. Tell me what surprised you most about this story. Did you know about the Battle of Diu? Were you aware of how revolutionary Portuguese naval technology was? What aspect of this history do you want to learn more about? Your engagement helps this channel grow and tells me what kind of content you want to see more of. So take 10 seconds right now, subscribe, and drop a comment. I read every single one, and your feedback directly influences what I create next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll dive deep into another fascinating chapter of history that changed our world forever.